Madison Willis reporting for EGV News. Educate, go out, and vote. Today, our topic is discrimination, and I will be talking about sexism. Sexism is essentially when someone is treated unfairly because of their sex, being male or female. In today's society, we see many types of sexism all over. It takes many different forms. We see it in pay difference, in lack of education. There are even laws about it. In most countries, women only earn between 60 to 75% of men's wage for the same work. On average, most women make 80 cents to men's dollar. In 2016, working women full-time pay is 80% of what men get paid. At this rate, it is expected for women to reach pay equality with men in 2059. In 2016, there was a state median annual earnings and earnings ratio for full-time, year-round workers by state and gender. Tennessee came in 13th place for the pay gap, with men making an average of $43,661 and women making an average of $35,916. Tennessee's earning ratio for men and women pay was 82%. Around 62 million girls are denied an education all over the world. Approximately 781 illiterates in the world, 2/3 are women. There have been laws put into action because of inequality between sexes, participation, and scholarships. Around 63 million girls still need to go to school worldwide. Over 150 countries around the world have at least one actively sexist law. Tennessee has a law in effect for this specific problem. The law states that Tennessee strictly forbids and will not tolerate discrimination or harassment of any employee.
On March 6, 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925, which included a provision that government contractors, in quote, take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment, without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. It was created to make America more equal. President Johnson extended affirmative action in 1965, affirming the federal government's commitment to promote equal employment opportunities. Affirmative action was extended to women by Executive Order 11375 in 1967 by adding the class of, in quote, sex to the list of protected categories. The initial emphasis was on education and unemployment. The concept of affirmative action has existed since the 19th century, but it wasn't a law until Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925 in 1961. Affirmative action is also a remedy under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where a court finds that an employer has intentionally engaged in discriminatory practices. In the past, the people who faced discrimination in the workplace or education could not do anything. They just sat there and kept silent. In 1960, people began to utilize affirmative action and bring the discrimination cases to the Supreme Court. Some statistics. Latinos earn 56 cents for every dollar white men earn. African American men earn 75% of what white males earn. More than 90,000 employment discrimination complaints were filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 2009.
Over 650 million people in the world live with disabilities. Persons with disabilities make up the world's largest and most disadvantaged minority. 20% of the world's poorest people live with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted July 26, 1990. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment. Title I requires employers with 15 or more employees to provide workers with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities that are available to others. This requires that employers make reasonable accommodations to the known physical or mental limitations of otherwise qualified individuals with disabilities. However, studies show that many workers with disabilities are paid less than the minimum wage. Due to a loophole in the Fair Labor Standards Act, employers may obtain a subminimum wage certificate that allows them to pay their disabled workers far below the minimum wage, typically falling between $2 and $5 per hour. A bill called Raise the Wage Act, sponsored by Democrats, which aims to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour, aimed to eliminate the subminimum wage. It was introduced to the House last year, but is not expected to pass under the Republican-controlled Congress. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits any entity that receives federal funding from discriminating against any person with a disability. The title applies to all public schools. However, multiple discrepancies have been observed in the past few years. For example, children with disabilities in the state of Tennessee receive corporal punishment at much higher rates than children without disabilities. Tennessee is one of only 22 states that allow schools to use paddling, spanking, or any other form of physical punishment. The Office of Civil Rights claims that children with disabilities were the only students subjected to corporal punishment in 158 schools across Tennessee. A bill sponsored by Tennessee Democrats aims to bar school officials from using corporal punishment on children with disabilities. The bill passed unanimously 28-0 earlier this year and has gone to Bill Haslam's desk to be approved. However, the violence for disabled children does not end there. Children who live with a physical, sensory, intellectual, or mental health disability are among the most stigmatized and marginalized of all groups in the country. Researchers report that 90% of individuals with intellectual impairments will experience sexual abuse at some point in their life. A disabled person is more likely to face violence and abuse at birth, and this increased risk for violence reappears throughout their lifespan. One thing that we can do to help people with disabilities is to bring awareness to problems that are going on in our own communities. Outreach programs have been very successful in their attempts to educate the public. Disability-specific interventions can also benefit marginalized groups. The most important thing you can do individually is to educate yourself on what is happening around you and vote for your own best.
LGBT discrimination is defined as the unjust or prejudiced treatment of different categories of people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. In some cases, it is based purely on perceived sexual identity of the victim. Hate crimes against the LGBT community account for just under 20% of total hate crimes, with a slight tendency towards violence, according to the public records of the FBI. Same-sex marriage was legislated on June 26, 2015, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down all state bans on same-sex marriage. Legislated it in all 50 states and required states to honor out-of-state same-sex marriage license. This verdict was reached on a 5-4 vote. Candidates for our local mayoral race in Washington County have expressed opposition to this ruling from years ago, with almost all candidates having expressed opposition to the ruling and voiced support for measures to redefine marriage as a union between one man and one woman. David Tomita is the only candidate in the Washington County mayoral race to support the legislation of same-sex marriage. Results of a study conducted: 1 in 3 LGBT students face bullying due to sexual orientation, and nearly 1 in 5 have either been threatened or injured on school property. Researchers and doctors writing for the JAMA, J-A-M-A, network report that gay and lesbian teens are more than twice as likely to contemplate suicide when compared to heterosexual teens, and nearly 3 times as likely to attempt it. Those results are more staggering when observing youth that identify as transgender. Transgender refers to the individual whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with his or her birth sex. A study conducted by the William Institute indicates that 42% of individuals between the ages of 18 to 25 have attempted suicide at some point in their life. Awareness of transgender rights specifically has raised due to President Donald Trump's ban on transgender Americans openly serving in any capacity in the military. In a memo signed by the president, he writes that transgender persons with a history or diagnosis of gender dysmorphia, individuals who have the policy states, may require substantial medical treatment, including medications and surgery, and disqualified them from service in the military, except under certain limited circumstances. A You Go Vote conducted with interviews 1,500 random adults resulted in 49% of surveyors saying they favor allowing transgender Americans to serve in the military, while 34% strongly support the ban. This parallels to the previously overthrown Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy from 1994 to 2011, which called for a discharge of any openly gay American in the armed forces. Federal laws supplemented by court decisions prohibit discrimination in such areas as employment, housing, voting rights, education, and access to public facilities. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Act have now been in place well over 50 years, but even with these well-established laws, racial inequalities in education, housing, employment, and law enforcement remain widespread throughout the United States. Many Americans think that racial patterns stem primarily from individual prejudices or racial attitudes. However, sociological research shows discrimination is more often the result of organizational practices and have unintentional racial effects on those based on cognitive biases linked to social stereotypes. Although racism and racial discrimination have come a long way, there are still too many instances of racial discrimination occurring. From a poll from Pew Research Center, when asked generally about discrimination in the country today, 57% said the bigger problem is people not seeing discrimination where it really does exist. 39% say the bigger problem for the country is people seeing discrimination where it really does not exist. Among Republicans and Republican leaners, 63% say the bigger problem in the country is people seeing discrimination where there actually is none. Conservative Republicans, 68%, are 16 points more likely to take this view than moderate and liberal Republicans, which are 52%. Views among Democrats and Democratic leaners are the reverse. 79% say that the bigger problem in the country is people not seeing discrimination where it really does exist. Comparably large majorities of liberal Democrats, 82%, and conservative and moderate Democrats, 76%, say this. Black men are nearly 3 times as likely to be killed by legal intervention than white men, according to the study which was published in American Journal of Public Health. Racial injustices and violence that is faced by the African American community has given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is often misunderstood. The Black Lives Matter movement focuses solely on the lack of accountability for violence committed against the African American community. Currently, nearly 1 out of 3 young black men will spend time in prison during his lifetime, a figure that rises to nearly 60% among young black high school dropouts. Facts about racial discrimination. After being arrested, African Americans are 33% more likely than whites to be detained while facing a felony trial in New York. In 2010, the United States Sentencing Commission reported that African Americans receive 10% longer sentences than whites through the federal system of the same crimes. In 2012, 51% of Americans expressed anti-black sentiments in a poll, a 3% increase from 2008. A survey in 2011 revealed that 52% of non-Hispanic whites expressed anti-Hispanic attitudes. Studies show that police are more likely to pull over and frisk blacks or Latinos than whites. In New York City, 80% of the stops made were blacks and Latinos, and 85% of those people were frisked compared to the mere 8% of white people stopped.
Police brutality is a prevalent issue in America. Not only is it a prevalent issue for everybody, but is specifically a problem for people of color. MappingPoliceViolence.org reports that police killed 1,147 people in 2017. Black people were 25% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. In 2014, 2 of the most infamous incidents of police brutality against African Americans were the fatal killings of Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Trayvon Martin. The reason this is so important is because these killings started a movement of people who cared about the issue called Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement is an essential topic because it brings up the issues of white America having prejudice against African Americans. Whites tend to excuse police brutality against blacks because of the racial hostility that they hold against blacks. To whites, blacks are viewed as deserving of harsh treatment in the criminal justice system. The Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin cases were also very similar and prompted the Black Lives Matter movement to get even bigger. Trayvon Martin was an unarmed American 17-year-old killed by George Zimmerman on February 26, 2012, sparking national controversy. All these are examples of violence in the African American community, and these cases prove the problem is real. As Malcolm X said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed, and loving the people who are doing the oppression.